This is the legend of a man named Jon. Born in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada, Jon grew up in a musical family. From an early age, Jon immersed himself in the beauty of piano. Through each lesson, Jon greatly improved his skills as a pianist, taking opportunity after opportunity to learn, perform, and rise to the occasion. Even during his early days at the Vancouver Academy of Music, many would have seen Jon's potential at that time. This would only grow with time, as Jon entered the University of British Columbia and eventually the Juilliard School. Jon was happy. And then a series of virtuosic breakthroughs occurred within just a few years. In 1984, Jon decided to compete in the Leeds International Piano Competition in Leeds, West Yorkshire, England, which is Britain's Grand Slam of international piano competition. Determined and focused, Jon practiced day and night to polish himself into the complete artist. By the time he arrived at the competition, Jon fervently and tirelessly competed at every round at Leeds. After weeks of intense competition, Jon became the first Canadian to win the grand prize at the Leeds International Piano Competition. This skyrocketed his career to new heights. Soon after, Jon received a royal command from Queen Elizabeth II to perform for her. A new horizon arose, and Jon continued to hone in on his skills. Becoming a complete artist in his own right, Jon performed with many of the world's leading orchestras, including the London Symphony Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, the Warsaw Philharmonic, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, the National Arts Centre Orchestra, the San Francisco Symphony, and the Scottish National Orchestra. Jon has also performed at the world-renowned Carnegie Hall and the Sydney Opera House, and he has performed for many Canadian Prime Ministers and Japanese Prime Ministers, as well as members of the U.S. Supreme Court. Realizing the importance of music education and cultivation of the next generation of pianists, Jon became the Artistic Director of the Honens International Piano Competition, Canada's Grand Slam of international piano competition. 2025 is a special year for Jon because Canada will hone in on Honens in October 2025, and while it will feature the newest champions of this Canadian Grand Slam, it will also feature the hard work, innovation, and ingenuity of Jon, also affectionately known to his friends as Jackie, and the board, staff, and volunteers of the Honens International Piano Competition. Therefore, it is time to hone in on Honens, and it is also time to tell Jon's story, Jon's adventures, Jon's legend. This is the legend of Jon Kimura Parker. Jackie, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure. It's great, Amos. I'm really delighted to be here.
So let's start off from the very, very beginning. What inspired you to pursue piano?
Well, I grew up surrounded by pianos, and we had a couple in the house when I was little. We eventually had four because my brother Jamie's a pianist, my sister Liz was studying the piano, and so it was there was always music going on. My mother's Japanese, and she had taken piano lessons growing up in Tokyo, and so she became a piano teacher. And in the meantime, my father's brother, Edward Parker, was a piano teacher, and the two of them were among the top piano teachers in the whole lower mainland, of British Columbia. I mean, just the number of students that went through both of their studios was enormous. But what really got me interested, there was an upright piano in our dining room right next to the kitchen, and my mom was, I think, preparing dinner, and I was 3 years old, and I had propped myself up on the piano bench. Of course, I couldn't reach the pedals or anything, and I just was poking around with a couple of fingers on the keyboard. And suddenly my parents recognized whatever their favorite, they recognized that I was playing the theme song from their favorite CBC radio show, a show they listened to 5 times a week, and that theme music, and I don't remember now what it is, but that theme music was played at the beginning and the end of that show. And I had worked it out by ear with 2 fingers. And so they thought, my goodness, he must have a good ear. You know, we should get him signed up for lessons. So I started lessons when I was 4, and I honestly never doubted from pretty much that moment that that's what I would do. Like I remember in grade 1, I grew up in Burnaby, just outside of Vancouver, and I remember, you know, kids being asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, and the boys in my class either said hockey player or fireman, and I said, well, I'm going to be a concert pianist. I mean, I actually used that whole phrase, concert pianist. You know, I just never doubted it. So that's how it happened.
That's incredible. And you mentioned just how the family dynamic also allowed you to have these kind of opportunities, and your parents noticing just your ability to hear and work it out by ear, an entire theme, before having any kind of education at that point. After that point, of course, you would study with your family, with your mom, Kiko Parker, and also with Edward Parker as well. Also, Professor Lee Kum-sing, who is also the first teacher of one of my earlier guests on the show, Ryan Wang, the first prize winner of the Canadian Chopin competition. Also, you would also study with Robin Wood. So you've had a very strong pedigree of teachers in your early years. What were the most profound lessons that you learned from each of them? And how have they formed the foundations of your musical style?
You know, it's really interesting because I was incredibly lucky to have the right teachers at the right time. And for example, basically, after learning the basics with a woman named Jessie Morrison, Edward Parker was my official teacher for something like about 10 years, I think. And my mom was never actually ever officially my teacher, because, you know, that can be a very difficult dynamic to make work. But she was my official daily coach. So, you know, we all understood that the lesson message would be coming through Edward Parker on Sunday mornings when I went in for lessons. But my mom reinforced it. I mean, she would sit through the lessons and she would reinforce it all week. And since she was very active as a piano teacher, she could hear everything that I wasn't quite doing right and remind me. So it was kind of like having a teacher at every lesson. It could not have been a better way to really develop what I needed at that time, which was, of course, fluency in reading music, an understanding of developing finger technique and coordination, and how to use the pedal, and you know, how to read a score properly, and just and learning music and style, and understanding all those things. And so and then there was a period where I was at a private school on Vancouver Island, the Shawnigan Lake School, for a couple of years of high school, and I just couldn't get to Vancouver often enough for lessons. So I would take the bus down to Victoria and take lessons from Robin Wood. And one of the things I learned from Mr. Wood was that there's actually more than one right way to do things. I mean, he was the first person to say that. I mean, teachers very often say, do this, do that. And he would say, do this or do that. Maybe don't do this, you know. But it was great to see that there were options, because that becomes the beginning of interpretation as you mature, is that you have choices, and you have to think about what they're going to be and make those choices carefully. So Edward Parker decided when I was about 15 that it was time for me to find a new teacher. And he was looking for somebody who would open my horizons artistically. And so I went to Mr. Lee. Lee Kum-sing immediately took me as a student, but he was very strict about a few things at first. He said, you know, you've been playing in all these local festivals and winning all these little prizes. And he says, you need to stop doing that for a couple of years, because we have serious work to do. And he really opened my eyes and ears to everything musical, just like how to actually think about breathing in music. That was very important to me, to the point that when I graduated from high school, I had only been studying with him for 2 years, and I wasn't quite ready to jump ship and go to a big school outside of Vancouver or anything. So I enrolled at UBC and continued to study with Mr. Lee for 2 more years. And it was during that time that one of the people who came through Vancouver to give a master class was the great pedagogue Adele Marcus. And I played for her in a master class, and she immediately said, "Would you come and play for me again privately before I leave town?" And I said, "Yes, I'd be happy to." And she said, "Well, you can never guarantee, because I know from a professor's standpoint, you never know how things are all going to turn out. But she says, I can come pretty close to guaranteeing you that I'll accept you into my class at Juilliard. And I encourage you to audition, even though you'd be a transfer student." And so I did that, and I ended up transferring out of second year at UBC over the summer to becoming a junior at Juilliard. And Adele Marcus was, just a different kind of teacher, and again, exactly the right kind of teacher. She was tough. She taught me a lot about the actually getting the sound out of the piano that I wanted. I remember Miss Marcus would say, she'd say, "Dear, I can see from your facial expression that you understand the emotion from this piece. I can see it in your body language. I just don't hear it yet." and so there'd be a lot to talk about, and that was fantastic. And then at other times in my development, the Hobig family in Vancouver, Gwen Hobig, who has just retired after decades as the concertmaster of the Winnipeg Symphony, and Des Hobig, who has just retired as a cello professor at Rice University, where I teach. Their parents and my parents got together when we were teenagers, and we started playing chamber music. And their father was my chamber music coach for years, and that was an enormous benefit to have that kind of training as a teenager. I also spent many summers in Banff, and loved being there, loved being surrounded by kids who all were as passionate about music as I was. And I studied with several people there, but the one I studied with the most was Marek Jablonski. He was the great Polish-Canadian pianist who really had that romantic performing spirit. And really, he played Chopin and Liszt like the greatest masters of that kind of solo virtuoso repertoire. And that was incredibly beneficial. So I feel very fortunate. I learned so much from so many different people.
Yeah, and hearing from all these different experiences, a lot of things come to mind from all these different teachers. First being when you mentioned that when you were studying with Edward Parker, your mom was sort of acting as your coach. For me, my mom was my first piano teacher and was my piano teacher for many years up until around, not yet my high school years, but essentially my junior high, middle school years at that point. At that point, I went to a second teacher by the name of Wang Yang. At that point, it was a similar dynamic to what you had, where he would be my teacher, but then my mom would be essentially the coach when I came back home, right? So for the better part of my formative years, up until when I entered university, this was essentially my life. Like, I lived and breathed piano for a long time. And then I decided to go into law instead, and that was a different story altogether. But essentially, I related a lot to that when you mentioned how you had at one point a teacher and then a coach at home to kind of reinforce what you were learning. And the second thing that also comes to mind is when you were learning from different teachers that there is more than one way to do a certain thing. It's fascinating because when I was speaking with Janina Fielkowska on her episode, she studied under Sasha Gorodnitsky, and he told her, we got to get rid of this French Cortot technique that you've been learning from your mom and from all the other people, because that is, that kind of thing. So he had to take a different approach to it. But Janina, as she mentioned in her episode, she had both now. She didn't sacrifice her previous earlier formative approach. She just incorporated these two different schools of thought into her own performance. And I think that's what, and we'll get into this later on in the episode, what I think maybe is a part of the complete artist philosophy, because that's essentially, you know, how much of a holistic view do you have on your ability to perform as an artist?
Yeah, that's very true. I think about, you know, one of the tricky things for me as a teenager and maturing into my 20s was I was always an instinctive player. Meaning among other things that I just always loved to perform. I mean, even when I was a little kid and then all the different stages you go through, I always liked to be on stage and I liked to perform, and I felt it brought out the best in me. And then I would, you know, get a lesson from Mr. Lee or later from Miss Marcus or from Mr. Jablonski, and the lesson would be something along the lines that I would start learning like a certain level of responsibility that I would have to the music that would require a little more work and a little more care and maybe slightly less flying by the seat of your pants when I'm performing. And then I would take those principles too seriously, and my playing would briefly get a bit, you know, very careful and focused, but kind of dull. And then I would let my, you know, inner performer shine again. And, you know, you go through all these stages. It's crazy. And a lot of those stages are happening in your early mid-20s, you know, and that's an important formative time, and that's exactly the target time for competitions like Honens, you know. So it's really interesting to see, you know. It's fascinating.
It truly is. And speaking about international competitions and that formative years, as you mentioned, there were quite a number of challenges that you faced along the way as your professional piano career began to take shape. And something that I didn't mention in the introduction was that you also had a great experience at the 1982 International Piano Competition in Chile, but then afterwards you went to 1984 at the Leeds International Piano Competition afterwards. When did you realize that you were ready for Leeds?
Oh, I didn't feel remotely ready for Leeds. I went to Leeds thinking that if I got through the first round, and in those days, you know, competitions are different now with video screening and pre-juries and everything. But I don't remember how many, but at least 60 or maybe 70 pianists showed up at Leeds in 1984. And I looked at all of their tiny little bios in the program, and they all looked more impressive than mine. And I thought, if I get through the first round, into the quarterfinals or however it worked, that would be a miracle. And I had a lot of friends in New York who says, you know, you might do really well. And I said, there's no way I'm going to do really well. And they said, no, well, I mean, you know, you should be prepared. You know, like do practice your concerto. You might actually need to know it, you know. And my concerto was Brahms 1, and that's a big one. And I'd never played it before, so I practiced it a lot. But I remembered thinking, finally, my motivation was, I mean, you know, there's all this kind of, we talk about the killer instinct and visualize your goals and all. I've never done that. Like, I'm just not that kind of person. And I just plan, you know, I don't budget, I don't plan, you know, I just kind of do everything that I think is going to be helpful, and then I just go and do, you know. So I went there finally thinking, well, if people say that I'm good enough that I might actually get through the first round or two, wouldn't it be unbelievable to be able to play the Brahms First Piano Concerto with orchestra, you know? And so that became a little bit of a goal. I thought, if I get to the finals, what an unbelievably amazing experience that would be. Because I just love Brahms, and I loved Brahms when I was in my 20s and was just really wanting to learn so much of it. And kind of, you know, that's what happened. So I went to Leeds. I mean, I knew I had won the Viña del Mar competition in Chile, and I had won the CBC Young Performers competition in Canada. And actually, a few years prior, I had won the Eckhart Grammaté competition in Brandon, Manitoba, which of course focuses on more contemporary music, Canadian composers. And so all of those were really important stepping stones. None of them, of course, had the enormous cachet of Leeds, but they were encouraging signs, I guess, But I did not feel ready for anything. I mean, I just thought, well, I'm 24. Who knows? I mean, let's try it out. I'm young enough that I can still age into the next cycle if I have to. Because most of these big international competitions run every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, wow. That is truly, truly fascinating, because there's often this sense from the average person who may look at really any major winner of any major Grand Slam or major piano competition and think, oh, these guys were destined to be the winners of these competitions, when really for some of them, like you said, in your experience, there's often that sort of uncertainty that goes in anyways. It's not destined. It's not destined that someone's going to win that. I mean, there could be maybe like a favorite, but then nothing is set in stone until the actual moment itself. Mm-hmm. So for you to set that path, though, you had to prepare for Leeds. And you mentioned briefly that you had to practice a ton of that Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1, as you never really performed it before. Aside from that, how did you prepare for Leeds at the time?
Well, probably the biggest commitment I made to preparation was that I bought an air conditioner for my New York apartment. I was living in a small one-bedroom in the Upper West Side on the 13th floor facing south, and I had never spent a summer in New York. And I just decided that I would work best if I was kind of isolated. And, most of my school friends were gone for the summer, and, I only had a few friends around. So, and I had a piano in my apartment finally, but it was just hot. And I didn't have a whole lot of money. So I went out and bought this tiny window unit, which turned out to be completely insufficient, but it lowered the temperature by a few degrees, enough that it wasn't totally miserable to practice. And then I just practiced. I mean, I worked, and every once in a while I would call up some friends and say, hey, can I play something through for you? Adele Marcus very generously gave me lessons throughout the summer, which isn't something that normally she would be doing. And because Leeds was in September, and I just gradually got myself ready. I mean, I remember going to a friend's apartment, the one person I knew who had 2 pianos, and playing through the Brahms with second piano just to try it out, I did a lot of recording myself, and of course in those days it was on a cassette recorder. It was the old Sony Walkman Professional D6 model, which was great, and you could actually make pretty good quality recordings if you bought a little mic to go with it. And I recorded myself I think in the last couple of weeks before going to Leeds, I recorded myself daily, and I would force myself to listen to as much as I had recorded and take careful notes on everything. So because, at that age, 24, you're starting to learn how to be your own teacher. You're starting to take everything that your teachers tell you and process it into your own idea of creativity and interpretation.
That is great. That's something that I think is so important, because at some point you can't always necessarily have a teacher forever, where hopefully all the experience that you have gathered over the years comes into that one experience as you grow as a pianist.
Yeah, I didn't really get at the time how much of it that is weighted towards being a pianist thing. Many other instrumentalists, as spectacular as they become, and as much as they are responsible for interpretations when they're in school playing sonata recitals and things, if they get into an orchestra and they let the orchestra be the primary way that they're making music, the majority of musical decisions are coming from above, right, from the conductor. And I know a lot of singers who, even the most successful professional, Metropolitan Opera singers, who still work, who still work regularly with coaches, and really understand that they will always benefit from that. Yeah. And I see pianists don't do that very much. We probably all should, but don't do it enough. And I think at a certain point when we're like maybe in our late 20s or early 30s, we think, okay, I'm on my own. I mean, the rest of the interpretations are all me. And I'm very fortunate that my wife, Aloysia, who's a violinist and violist, is a fantastic musician. So, I mean, she's coached me on new repertoire all through my late 20s and 30s. And other friends of mine whose musicianship I really trust, I'm always happy to play for them and get ideas.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with just the mindset of a pianist, where in your case, and even in my case as well, we're often practicing on our own. When we perform, they're usually solo performances, and our preparation is spent completely isolated or mostly isolated from other people around us, aside from our teachers and from our coaches. So that contrast with string players, that contrast with vocalists, because many of their works, like for example, my cousin Kirsten Leung, as a violinist, of course he does a lot more solo performances now, but there are many opportunities for him where he has to perform with a string ensemble, quartet, trio, and whatnot. And even for other violinists, they would perform with orchestras and all that sort of thing as well. With vocalists, you got the choir, you've got your own individual roles, along with other groups of singers in different kind of capacities, because the score requires a certain scoring of different voices and how they relate. But for piano, as I mentioned, we're usually alone. So I think that mindset bleeds into how we approach practicing, how we approach even just associating even later career, what that would look like in terms of trying to grow ourselves. It's a very individualistic approach, which has its pros and cons at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's true. I was just doing a lightning round of questions for the Minnesota Orchestra, where I have a position as creative partner. And one of the questions they asked was, what do you prefer, solo piano or chamber music? And like with no hesitation, I answered chamber music. As much as I love solo piano music, and we have so much of it and how great it is, the act of being a solo pianist is lonely. And something I've discovered over the years is how much I value being around other musicians and working together. So it's amazing. But anyway, we do have this treasure trove of solo music, no question.
Yeah. And I relate to that part where you mentioned that you want to be around other chamber musicians. For me, it's even larger than that. Like in general, with life becoming a lot more isolating as well, I mean, social media is a big thing about in this day and age, but as life becomes a lot more stratified over time, that sense of community, I think, is something that I think a lot of people in my age group in general sort of long for. So that sense of community, that sense of belonging, that sense of just not being isolated from everybody is, I think, that's starting to grow. And I think that's also why music competitions and really music events overall in the classical music sphere has sort of burgeoned, sort of expanded, I should say, from this need of increased or the rekindling of communities as that. So I think some or a lot of people would relate to that sentiment of just want to be around other people. In your case, of course, chamber musicians.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It just feels to me, I just feed on that energy. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And speaking about the energy, I can imagine that the energy from Leeds was intense. So take us through every round of Leeds, all the way to the very end. And then
trying to think of what I can remember. It was a long time ago. I remember that this was still the days when competitions had a prescribed list of pieces that you would have to play. So I think in the first round, which was short because there were so many people, we had to play one Chopin etude, one Mozart sonata and something from a list of, shorter to medium length romantic works, and which in my case was the Chopin Fourth Ballade. And most people were starting, a lot of people were starting with their etudes so that they could show their, fantastic skill right away. And I did everything all backwards, but the main thing was I didn't want to start flashy, because I thought, I want this to feel like a recital. I don't want this to feel like I'm competing. I want it to feel like a recital. And I want to be seen as a musician. When I went to Leeds, among the previous two winners were Murray Pariah and Radu Lupu, two of the greatest musicians / pianists of our time, and I was very conscious of that. And, I didn't look at Leeds winners as being super virtuosos as much as I looked at them as being artists. And so I thought, if I start with the Chopin Fourth Ballade, I'm literally starting with a single open G octave that gradually unfolds, like a rose blooming, unfolds into the music of the piece. And then, of course, it does build up to something very virtuosic and exciting at the end, but not in an empty way. That's one of the fullest expressions of humanity, that piece, all in, 13 minutes or so. And so that's how I started. And then I just sort of treated Mozart, and I played the octave etude, I think. But those were kind of just like encores or a bonus, And then when I got to the next solo round, there was chamber music in there somewhere. I played the Beethoven Kreutzer Sonata with the violinist. And there was a solo recital, which was incredibly disappointing when I first filled out the application for Leeds, that my big romantic work, and that semifinal round was a longer round. It was more like 45 minutes or something. And my big romantic work that I started studying with Adele Marcus when I moved to New York in 1979 and was studying with her at Juilliard was the Schumann Fantasy. And I had played the Schumann Fantasy at the Vigna del Mar competition, and I think I played it at the CBC. But I mean, it was a piece that I had been thinking about for years, and I was young enough and brave enough that I was actually technically able to play the second movement, and the whole piece felt organic and whole. And of the big romantic works listed for Leeds, for some reason, the Schumann Fantasy wasn't on that list. The Liszt Sonata was, and a bunch of other works. And I looked at it, and and none of them were works that I'd played. Because, early 20s, there's a lot you haven't played yet. So I ended up choosing the Brahms Handel Variations, which is an enormous work, which I was also learning and playing for the first time. But, as I mentioned before, I felt good about my instinct for Brahms. So that was a huge project. And what I remember clearly about half an hour before going out to play was I was practicing the Brahms Handel on a warm-up piano backstage, and I was in the middle of, one of the variations in the middle, and I had a memory slip. And I got really tripped up as to whether my right hand goes this way or that way. And in variations, it's very easy to have memory slips because the harmonic structure is the same all the time. And, the signposts all look and sound the same, And so I got totally freaked out, and I stopped, and I reached for my score. And right at that moment, the proctor came back and says, "You're on." And I was so flustered, I just dropped the score and I went. And I thought, if I'm on stage and I'm actually thinking too hard about that variation, I'll get lost. And instead, what I need to do is turn my brain off about one variation prior and just go on automatic pilot. And then once I get through that variation, become really present again. And anybody who's performed knows exactly what I'm talking about. If you've practiced a piece enough, you can play it on automatic pilot. Might not be very inspired, but you'll probably get through it because you're not overthinking anything. And so I actually was able to do that, and I was surprised that I had that kind of mental control. But I was able, I knew that variation was coming up, and I just kind of turned off and just let my fingers go. And I was able to just let it happen. And then I took over afterwards, and it was fine, and I got through it fine. Then a terrible thing happened in that round. My other big work was the Barber Sonata. And the Barber Sonata is a big American sonata written in 1959 or 60. It has 4 movements, and the last movement is a famously difficult fugue with a kind of a jazzy rhythm subject. You know, it's great, and it's so beautifully written, and but really, really tricky. And it also happens to be one of the few pieces in the standard repertoire. It wasn't quite in the standard repertoire in 1984, but it certainly is now. But it was, it's one of the pieces that you need to use the middle pedal, the sostenuto pedal, which is a pedal I rarely use. But there's a couple of places in the fugue where you need to sustain a bass chord or an octave or a note or something and then play with some clarity in the other 2 hands. And I had never checked the sostenuto pedal, and the sostenuto pedal on the semifinals Steinway Concert D Grand Piano in the Leeds International Piano Competition, the sostenuto pedal failed. And I don't think anybody else had any reason to use it, and I just don't think it had been checked. And what happened was it sustained that low chord fine, but then it started picking up other dampers while I was playing, so the sound became really blurred. And then I realized I'm going to have to let go of, wait, which pedal should I let go of? And I got a little flustered. So I got flustered enough that I ended up getting lost. And here I was, having survived the whole Brahms incident with the Handel variations, and now I was getting lost, and I had been playing really well, and I felt really good about the round. And I remembered a moment that is in the upper left corner. I mean, I don't have photographic memory, but you know, in the old days of sheet music where you'd have 2 pages in front of you, you'd sometimes remember something would be in the upper left corner, for example. And I remembered that there's a low B flat in the upper left-hand corner, and a bunch of crashing chords, and that it leads into the section that leads into the coda. And so I just jumped to it. And I think I left out, I don't know, a page and a half or something of music. I jumped to it, and I kept going, and I got to the end of the piece. Everything went fine. I planned that round that I finished, even though that would be the obvious way to finish the round. I actually finished with a short 3-minute ditty, so it would kind of look like I was playing an encore. And I did that, and to this day, I don't actually know how many jury members noticed that I had an issue, but they were either impressed that I got out of it without losing focus, or it's possible, because of course many of the jury members were quite elderly, it's possible that they weren't that familiar with the Barber and just didn't even know anything had happened. So at any rate, I got through it. Then when they announced the 6 finalists, I suddenly realized that I was going to be playing Brahms 1 with orchestra. I also simultaneously realized that there was an awful lot about playing that concerto with orchestra that I didn't know. And this is where I benefited from an extraordinary gesture from a very good friend of mine who was in the competition, which is Norman Krieger, who's a wonderful pianist, a great American pianist. He's the chair of the piano department at University of Indiana in Bloomington. At the time, he was another pianist in Adele Marcus's studio who was a couple of years older than me, and he had also put down Brahms 1 for the finals, and he had actually performed Brahms 1 in New York with, I think, the New York Youth Symphony. So he actually knew how it went, and he knew, you know, all the orchestra stuff. And he was one of about 5 or 6 people in the 1984 Leeds competition who came down with a virus that basically knocked him out. I think even a couple jury members got ill, but not so ill that they couldn't attend. But like the whole town, like people were getting sick, and Norman just couldn't get through his second round. I mean, he easily got into the second round. He couldn't get through it, and he was just too sick. And so he decided to stay in Leeds and sort of see, first of all, to get better. And he was significantly better by the time the whole next round had proceeded, and it was announced that I was going to be in the finals. And Norman Krieger said to me, Jackie, let's find a place with two pianos, and I'll play through the accompaniment with you, and I'll tell you all the stuff you need to know about what happens in the orchestra. Like, for example, there's a horn solo here, bom, 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 beam, bom, bom, and you're going to need to accompany that. Like, if you just play, the horn will end up being behind you because they take time on that moment. It's a horn. The first note probably will speak a little later than you expect. You have to be prepared to listen for that. And thankfully, I had a lot of chamber music experience, so I understood how to accomplish those things, but I would not have expected all of them without his help. So that was an enormous gesture of friendship on his part. When I went in for my rehearsals with the orchestra, I felt confident. You know, I felt I actually know what to expect. And so I guess the final thing to tell you, if I'm taking you through all the details of Leeds from so long ago, is the awards ceremony, where the 6 finalists are sitting there, and there's Fanny Waterman, who was the founder and chairwoman of the competition, and the Duchess of Kent, who was a member of the royal family, who was presiding as the royal representative and also handing out awards. And the six finalists, we were sitting on stage and we had absolutely no idea how this was going to go until Fanny Waterman announced 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd, and my name hadn't come up yet. And then she said, fantastic, you know, classic British accent, well, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to know who's won, Jon Kimura Parker. And I really couldn't believe it. And I stood up. The Duchess of Kent handed me a medal and a certificate. And then I went over to Fanny Waterman, and I gave her a hug, and I kissed her on both cheeks. And the Duchess of Kent leaned over to me and says, don't you think I should get one too? And so I went back to the Duchess of Kent and I kissed her on the cheek, which unfortunately was a massive breach of royal protocol. I mean, even though she had initiated it, BBC 4, I think it was, but anyway, there were only 4 channels on television in those days. One of the BBC channels was carrying this whole thing. And they didn't happen to be focused on the Duchess at the moment that she invited me over for the embrace. And they were focused on Richard Baker, who was a BBC commentator, who says, Mr. Parker has accepted the prize, and Mr. Oh dear. And the next day, the London Times and the Guardian and the Financial Times and like all the serious press had serious articles about Leeds covering the finals and, you know, all the performances and everything. And then all the rag newspapers that never would have bothered to cover Leeds all had a photo of me kissing the Duchess with headlines like, cheeky Canadian pianist breaks royal protocol. Another one said, Brahms and kissed, which was a takeoff of the Cockney rhyming slang Brahms and Liszt, which, believe it or not, is Cockney rhyming slang for pissed, as in drunk. And so it was kind of all this extra attention that nobody expected. And of course, no harm was done. The Duchess of Kent thought it was hilarious. About a month later, you mentioned my command performance for Queen Elizabeth, and what happened was she and Prince Philip were on an official visit to Canada later in the fall of 1984. And one of their stops was in Toronto. It was already scheduled that the Toronto Symphony would perform a brief concert for the royal couple. And I was invited to play a little bit on that program. And I mean, this was only a couple months after the competition, and I said, well, how about Brahms 1? And they said, you know, we're just doing short excerpts of things, and maybe Brahms is a bit too heavy. Have you ever played Rock 2? And I said, well, I started learning it. And they says, well, we're just going to do an excerpt from the last movement. It's only 5 minutes worth. So that's what I played in my command performance. And there was a royal receiving line after the performance where I met the Queen and I met Prince Philip. And we were counseled ahead of time that when you meet the Queen, do not extend your hand. Her Majesty will extend her hand to shake your hand. At that point, it is acceptable for you to, reciprocate. And she is to be referred to as Your Majesty, and Prince Philip is to be referred to as Your Royal Highness. Please do not confuse these two. And there's about 10 of us in the receiving lines, Andrew Davis, the conductor, and all of us, and he knows how this goes, but I was like frantically trying to get all these details straight. And suddenly I have the Queen of England in front of me, and the moment we're facing each other, the press started taking massive numbers of photos because they thought I was going to try to kiss the Queen, like I had a reputation, bad boy, and of course I was incredibly well behaved. And she held out her hand, and I shook her hand, and she said, "Congratulations on your recent success in Leeds." And I was like shocked that she even knew about it. And I said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." And then Prince Philip leaned in and said, "Well, I understand there was a bit of a tiff about you and the Duchess. Do tell." And so I had this embarrassing episode of explaining the whole thing to Her Majesty, and kind of making a joke like that was actually a royal command when I kissed the Duchess on the cheek. And Queen Elizabeth said, well, I know Catherine quite well, and she does love to get people in trouble. Well, very nice to meet you. And off they went. So that was my conversation with the Queen. It was incredible.
That's amazing. That's hilarious. My goodness. But I will say this. I mean, your experience with the Queen and also with Prince Philip, it's actually not surprising for me at all, because many years ago, when I used to host another podcast a number of years ago when I was still in law school, and I interviewed Governor General David Johnston. When he went to Balmoral Castle, this would have been 2010, to meet with the Queen and Prince Philip for the first time, actually, they were very, very casual, according to David Johnston. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Johnston, when I was talking with him, he said they were very generous, to the extent where they were offering to take Mr. Johnston and Mrs. Johnston to the stables to go to the horses, because they knew that they had a shared passion for horses at the time. So, but they didn't have the shoes because they were dressed up in full white tie, as you would need to do for these sorts of occasions. So the Queen said to Mr. Johnston, "Oh, but you don't have the right shoes, though." And then Prince Philip then says and looks down at Mrs. Johnston's feet and back at Queen Elizabeth's feet, and he says, "Same size, my dear, I think." Queen Elizabeth herself runs up the stairs, picks up a pair of brogues, and gives it to them for the entire weekend.
Love it. I love it. Look, of course, they're people, I mean, she was an absolutely astounding, incredible monarch. This unbelievable life of service and protocol, underneath it, there's no way she was going to give up a chance to show off her horses. So, it's that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So like when you were mentioning your interaction with both of them, I wasn't surprised at all, because they're very, I've heard from other people like David Johnston, that they're just very down to earth people. Yeah. And even when you mentioned about how you had a memory slip and then you had to go on stage right before you had a chance to kind of look at it, but then you realized that you had that strategy of not overthinking that one part, and that typically goes better. I had a similar incident. It's not a memory slip, but it's more of like if I just think too hard, I cannot technically perform this one part properly. And that's in Liszt's Dante Sonata, nearing the end, where you have these jumping octaves and chords.
Oh yeah,
where it's like exactly, it's like ba da 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 da. That part, that last variation of that, that part is like, for me, my technique was, if I can just focus, not too hardly, of course, but focus on the right hand, getting that melody across. That left hand, of course, I don't want to be messy, but as long as that left hand just kind of gets across without being tripped up, I'm fine. So, like a similar instance for me in that situation, it wasn't a memory slip, it was more like a technical, oh my goodness, like Franz Liszt, what on earth were you thinking when you wrote that one part?
Right, I know. Well, of course, you got to remember one of the things that those composers were thinking, even Liszt, but certainly Beethoven, is that the pianos had much lighter actions in those days, and those things were actually easier to play. I mean, some of the technically awkward things, and especially leaps that are so difficult to play accurately, there's just so much commitment of effort to play a single note on a modern piano that's part of why those things have become so transcendently difficult. I mean, and of course, we're used to the feel of a modern piano. It's not that it would be easy to sit down on a forte piano and do that stuff, because we're so used to the piano fighting back a little bit that would be weird, so it would take some time to get used to.
Yeah. And out of curiosity, I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but like, what's the difference between the action between a period instrument and a modern piano? Given that difference, like what causes the reasons? What's the reason for things being a lot more difficult to play now compared to what it was back then?
I'm not an expert on historical pianos, but moving from a wooden frame to a metal frame certainly created the possibility of an instrument where you could put a lot more tension on the strings and not bend the frame. And the way the whole hammer and key assembly was built, there's just a lot more parts and also more weight inherent in that action. So you're just working with bigger machinery in a way, but a piano technician could give you a much, much better reason for how, all the different things that have changed. A lot of things have changed. And the double escapement, the ability to play fast repeated notes is something you simply could not do on a much older piano. They hadn't worked out the way that the hammer only comes partway back and all that stuff. But, and of course, on modern day pianos, I'm a Steinway artist. I play on Steinways most of the time, and Steinways are all different. I mean, they're handmade. There's, or parts of them are, and there's some instruments feel relatively easy to play. Some are quite, they fight back, and they're heavy, and that would make that coda passage in the Dante, kind of impossible. So, yeah.
Basically, yeah. I know that with my own piano at home, it was one of those fighting back types of situations where even in practice, I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, this piano's going to be the end of me. But I think in a way it also kind of gives, at least in my experience, it gives me a bit of practice. Even it's almost like a workout training almost. It's like if you're able to take on this heavy weight and you're moving to like a lighter weight, it's going to be easier, at least in some aspects. So for me, I would find myself honestly flying some of these passages when I play on actual concert venue pianos rather back in the day, because I'm used to like challenging action and challenging responsiveness at home. And when I'm out there, I actually had to slow down because I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is actually...
Yeah, it's like you feel like you have an out-of-control race car or something. But that's a very good strategy when you're young. It helps you develop strength, also helps you develop an instinct for projecting sound. I noticed, I've been teaching at Rice University at the Shepherd School of Music for 25 years. And I see my students doing the same thing that I used to do when I was a student, which is closing the piano lid all the way and then putting the music rack on top of a closed lid to dampen the piano as much as possible to sort of encourage you to play out and to play more. And so that when you're on a real piano on stage, you're not struggling. And of course, you have to be careful, like you said, in the other way, that you're not being too aggressive. You know, you have to get it just right.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the closed lid. For me, practicing piano, that was basically 100% of the time. And it wasn't even intentional. It's just because, like, at home, you don't want to disturb everybody, and it just went do that. Right. But in a way, it was actually a blessing. As now, from hearing from what you mentioned, it's actually a blessing at the end of the day, because it trained me in many ways to project myself. Of course, you don't want to go too far, like you said, but I was able to project myself in a way that I may not would have been able to do so if I just always opened the piano all the time. Mm-hmm. So that's really fascinating, though. Mm. After Leeds, of course, your career would explode and would reach brand new heights. But you also went down an educational path as well. And I think one interesting educational path that you did, one of the checkpoints, I should say, was that you appeared on a 30-minute special episode of Under the Umbrella Tree on CBC back in the old days. And I actually, for those of you interested, you can watch the whole episode on YouTube even now. What was it like to film with the crew, and like that kind of preparation for educating for that younger audience? What was it like?
Well, first of all, I love playing for a younger audience, and I do school concerts whenever I'm asked and whenever there's time. And I get such a kick out of it. Like for me, like third grade, grade 4, that's like the sweet spot, and I'll play theme music from, a TV show that I know that they're going to know, or a movie. Like the last couple of years, I've been playing the Peaches song from the Super Mario Brothers movie, and in years past, I would play the theme music from The Simpsons or something that they recognize and get them drawn in. Like they're not going to be bored. This is actually going to be fun. And then by the time it's over, I've shown them how musical structure works, how Beethoven constructed a symphony out of Lego, and I'll play actual classical music for them, and they'll be understanding something about it. And I just get such a charge out of that. So any chance to do something educational, and by the way, I'm always amazed when I do my sort of demo about Beethoven. I'm amazed to see adults, like the school teachers coming up to me afterwards and saying, "Oh boy, I really learned a lot from that." And I'm like, "Hooray, great, that's good." When I filmed the Under the Umbrella Tree episode, it was, well, first of all, this is sort of like Sesame Street, like there were puppets, and I was interacting with puppets and carrying on conversations with them, as well as with Holly, who was the other lead character. And so how it works with the puppets, because I used to watch Sesame Street, not when I was a kid, but when my little sister was a kid, I would watch it with her. And, they all the Muppets and everything. How do you do that? And so the way they did it in Under the Umbrella Tree was they had certain sets that were very compact, like the piano, for example. They brought in a grand piano for that episode. And they brought in a little area that looked like a balcony in a theater where they were sitting and watching the concert and everything. And those are constructed in the studio on little tiny islands, but there's a lot of space to maneuver around them. And then the puppeteers, and this just blew my mind, the puppeteers had, and all of these sets were constructed to be a little bit off the surface of the ground. The puppeteers were on dollies, lying on their backs, pushing themselves around with their feet. So just imagine you're lying on your back, your head and your back are on a dolly, and then they had a black and white TV monitor showing what the camera was seeing, which of course would be a totally different perspective, lying down and like figuring out which direction you need to go. And of course nothing was wireless in those days, so that was connected to a long cord that they had to make sure didn't get tangled up in something. And then he'd be holding up a puppet, and the puppet would be carrying on a conversation, and he'd be looking on this little tiny black and white screen to realize he needed to go this way or that way, and then he could quickly move to another location by wheeling himself around. It was just amazing to watch them in action and to be in a studio and just see how this was produced. And to be able to have conversations with mice living inside the piano was really fun. So I then went, I did more, I enjoyed that experience so much, I jumped at a chance to do something else. More than 20 years ago, it was a series called Whole Notes, which was done by Bravo TV. And that we were able to delve into the lives of different composers and tell some stories, and I could demonstrate on the piano. We involved the Winnipeg Symphony for the first season. We involved Pinchas Zukerman and the National Arts Center Orchestra, I remember, for the second season. And really, it's just, and again, this was more educational for adults, but about classical music, and so much fun to do.
Yeah, even just you mentioning all these different experiences, and especially with both for the kid audience and for the adult audience, it's fascinating to know and to just consider all the work that goes into making such productions seamless and possible for educating the public on that one. Because especially even going back to Under the Umbrella Tree, I think even just the act of, as you mentioned, back in those days it wasn't wireless, but there's also kind of like a little charm towards, I don't want to say low tech, but tech from the older times, from previous decades compared to now. You have to be creative, and that I want to say ironically, or ironically is not the right word, but that actually further enforces what you're doing as a pianist, but also outside for what they're doing in a production capacity as well, because creativity is what really inspires and gets people going, versus nowadays we're facing all this AI nonsense and all this automated nonsense as well, where you're not even allowing people to even create something, let alone be creative. You're almost automatons to a certain extent. So seeing that the creative process of bringing that production into place, and then seeing adults being so inspired, even not just children but adults too, about classical music and also the different composers, that is so encouraging to see, because I think we need to bring some of that back into today's world.
Yeah, very much so. Absolutely.
Yeah. And even in my experience, when I was helping out as one of the organizers and hosts of the Canadian Chopin competition earlier this year in 2025, for me, my approach was more focused on, especially for people in my age group, being in my 20s and whatnot. Many in my social group are not musicians at all. They were athletes, or they played a sport. So for them, and even on this podcast to a certain extent, I use sports terminology. So even just saying like Grand Slam, majors, I'm borrowing that from tennis. Or if I'm talking about like the Olympics of piano, being like Chopin or cliburn or any of these Grand Slams, like that sort of thing, for them they understood that. So when I gave them that kind of analogy, they're like, oh, so that's the level that these guys are playing at. And then when they come to the Canadian Chopin competition, or really any major piano competition, national or international, they're like, wow, not only am I hearing really good musicians, all of them are really, really good. So it's so close. Like how do you even pick? I'm like, you see, now that's where the beauty of competitions are.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It is. My experience at Honens over and over again has been about how to make those decisions, which are very, very difficult when you have so much talent in front of you. And who are we going to especially reward this week? Well, we're going to talk about Honens, I think, in a minute, but there's just so many factors. It's huge.
Exactly. And one major factor is musicality. What is musicality to you?
Musicality is, we might talk a little bit about levels, like there's pianism, which is your ability to just play the instrument. There's musicality, which maybe speaks a little more to your making something not sound mechanical, making something have a musical line to it, or to reflect the style of a composer, or to know when your personality needs to be a part of the music, and maybe those times when it doesn't so much. And then we sort of work our way up to artistry. And that whole idea that there's a synthesis of a lot of things that you're expressing through your musicianship, and through your technical ability and your pianism and everything else, but that you're serving maybe at that point a slightly higher purpose. And so musicality or musicianship is basically that first stage of taking the music off the page, making it come to life, whether it's, and understanding, you know, if you play an early piece by Robert Schumann, you are being invited to be personal with his music. He was so personal in the way that he wrote it, and he's inviting you to be personal in your interpretation. If you're playing a Debussy prelude, you have the responsibility to create layers of sound. I like to tell my students it's a little bit like layers in Photoshop, you know, that one of those sounds is going to stay in the background the whole time, and other things are going to emerge a little bit. But maybe you don't want to introduce a really wildly personal rubato. And if you're playing Beethoven, let's think about the structure of it, and what is the structure? Let's identify it, and then how can you show it? People get so deadly serious about Beethoven, but my goodness, I mean, so much of early Beethoven is filled with humor. It's incredible, and late Beethoven is filled with, you know, a different kind of humor, but it's definitely there, you know, and so all of those kinds of, you know, understanding the different styles of composers, physically understanding the instruments so you know how to bring a musical line out of it. All of that is part of this idea of musicianship or musicality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you mentioned about how even late Beethoven has his sorts of humor. And that's something that even in a composer's darkest moments or darker moments, they are still able to smile and shine through. And I think Chopin is also a good example of that as well. It also says a lot about even just, I mean, everyone in general. Like, everyone has their dark moments and stuff. But, you know, speaking as a lawyer myself, we often have something like lawyer humor or dark humor. It's like, when I look at just certain things, like, it is, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and we just say it a certain way. But yeah, absolutely, that sense of being able to see just the light at the end of the tunnel in like absolute darkness or relative darkness. And this sort of musicality and this development of the musical style all really comes down to what you try to achieve at Honens. And as we get into this discussion, as we hone in on Honens, we have to start off with Esther Honens. Who is she?
Esther Honens was a woman. She was an amateur pianist, but she was a woman who worked, I believe, as a office manager for Burke's Jewelry in Calgary. And she saved all her money. She invested her money well. I mean, she was not a spectacularly wealthy person at first, but she really invested well and saved well. And she had heard the cliburn competition and how much attention it had drawn to the city of Fort Worth. And she'd also heard a lot of musicians in Calgary, and she knew what the city was capable of. And she said, I don't see any reason why Calgary can't be just as good, why we can't do this here. And she was really passionate about it. And since piano was her passion, she wanted to start an international piano competition in Calgary. She left a $5 million gift. And there was a rather immediate process of getting that competition off the ground in 1992. Because Esther Honens had Parkinson's. It didn't look like, they weren't sure if she would make it through to hearing the competition. Now, my involvement with Honens actually goes back to that year, to 1992, because I was invited to be on that jury. And that was in the days, like when I went to Leeds, where I think we had about 70 competitors all descended on Calgary. They all had to have home hosts and with pianos. And I mean, it was a massive logistical undertaking. And the jury had distinguished older pianists on it. Anton Querty, for example. It also had Janina Filkovska on it, and that's where we became really good friends. I was the youngest person on it was a big jury too, bigger than it probably needed to be. I think it was like 11 or something. But I was the youngest on the jury. I was so young. I was 32. The oldest competitor was Sergei Babayan, who was either 29 or 30. And I felt like I remember after he played La Valse, which was spectacular, I remember thinking, I have no right to be judging somebody who's 2 years younger than me. This is crazy. But Honens wanted to have a young Canadian on the jury, maybe as a sort of a message. You know, this is somebody who's won an international piano competition and has a very active career. And it would be great to have them involved. And I had a ton of experience at that point. I mean, I had toured all over the world. And the Toronto Symphony had taken me on a tour to Asia as their soloist. The St. Paul Chamber Orchestra had taken me to Europe, and we played in 15 cities in Europe in 17 days. I mean, I just had a lot of experience. So I was able to meet Esther Honens very briefly. We had a lovely conversation. I just told her how, you know, what an honor it was for me to be on the jury. She was not well. She was given a private box that she could attend the competition for its duration, and she literally passed away 5 days after that competition, having seen her dream realized. And it's a remarkable story, and it has a very happy ending in that she was able to see the first competition happen, and it was such an honor for me to be involved. I was involved briefly in the second Honens competition in 1996 as a kind of a celebrity presence for the first few days. I was there for the opening ceremony. I had to play the Beethoven Appassionata Sonata for everybody, which was terrifying because I had the whole jury and all that year's competitors in the audience. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking. Who's going to be willing to do that? Oh, let's ask Jackie. He won't think about it until it's too late. So it was so scary. And then I was on the jury again. Then I had nothing to do with Honens for a while, but I was on the jury again in 2012, I think it was. Yes, 2012. I had a student competing in 2015. And then in 2017, I was invited to become the new artistic director, in a way that the artistic direction and the executive direction would be two different people, you know, obviously working very much in harmony and working together. And I will say at this point, as soon as I took on that position, I had to inform my students that I could not condone their entering Honens while I was artistic director. I mean, I don't vote actually, but I just thought not appropriate. You know, and I hate to do that. There are other competitions that they routinely enter. I mean, this year I had one student in the Chopin competition at Warsaw, and I had another in Cliburn. So, which is fine, you know, but not Honens. So, at any rate, that's Esther Honens' background, and also my history with Honens right from the very beginning.
Nice, and that is, as you said, a very, very good story, and truly one that, thank goodness, had a happy ending. Literally within a matter of 5 days, just between seeing that dream fulfilled and then her passing. Yeah. And with your pathway to becoming artistic director for Honens, take us through a day in that life of this position.
Well, every day is totally different. And there was a very clear understanding that this is a position where there are times when it's obviously very important that I'm in Calgary, when we put on the festival, when we put on the competition, and for other specific events throughout the year. But I don't live in Calgary. I live in Houston, Texas, where I'm the chair of the keyboard department at Rice University. And I'm on weekly Zoom meetings with the absolutely astounding team of people that we have working at Honens. And every month sort of has a slightly different flavor, like a very busy time for me is about a year after a competition, which is 2 years before the next competition, which is when I have to get really busy inviting everybody that we need for the competition from the outside, which is an international jury. And I like my jury to be as diverse as possible in as many different ways as you can be diverse, whether it's not just the obvious ones like ethnicity, but also gender and also age and experience. And what type of musician are they? Are they an actively performing pianist? Are they an administrator who books pianists in recital series because they have great taste about pianists? And, as many different kinds of people as possible. I also have to invite a conductor for them to perform with the Calgary Philharmonic if they make it to the finals. This year we have a collaborating cellist, we have a collaborating string quartet, we have a collaborating composer, and one of the things that I immediately did when I came on board as artistic director at Honens was returned to the idea of commissioning a Canadian composer to write a piece for the semifinalists to play. I think that had been done once before, but it wasn't a regular thing. And I thought, what better gift can you give a Canadian composer than to say, you're going to write a piece that is going to be performed spectacularly 10 times, by 10 different people who may perform it again, and really, keep it going. We have a very special position called a mentor in residence, which is someone of great esteem who is not a jury member and they don't vote, but they hear everybody and they meet with all 10 of our semifinalists for an hour each, maybe give them some feedback, maybe give them some advice, answer questions, and just be some kind of a resource. So, and actually when I started at Honens, sometimes it feels like things are just going so smoothly. The Honens team in the office are just so brilliant, and Amanda, who's our president and CEO, is so brilliant and so committed, and everybody else who works there. And sometimes things are humming along fine, but when I first came on board at Honens, we had a competition in the fall of 2018. And the first thing that happened a couple of months into my position was that one of the jury members canceled. And the reason you invite jury members 2 years in advance is you need to get them to block off almost 2 full weeks of time. And if they are active performers, or if they're professors, they have to really think about how they're going to block off that time and how they're going to make it work. And so if somebody cancels and you've only got 6 months to find a new person, that's actually really iffy. Actually, the first thing that happened was the mentor canceled that year. And I went into a panic because I thought I need somebody who's really prestigious, and that person has to come be a real draw for these semifinalists, somebody that they would really want to meet and perform a short program. And I was so lucky because one of my good friends in the piano world is also somebody who I revere, who's about 10 years my senior. We met many, many years ago, and we used to live a few blocks apart from each other, is Garrick Olson. And I contacted Garrick, and it was just one of those things. Like I thought, well, if he's not available, he'll tell me immediately, but he'll already know that he's not available because it was coming up season. And he's a busy guy. But we were able to make it a fairly compact period where he could still hear everybody and meet everybody, and he didn't have to be there for 2 weeks or anything. And he was able to do it, and he had a recital program that he was dying to play, and it was just perfect. I mean, it was incredible. And I looked like a hero because I got Garrick Olson. Well, I mean, he was amazing. And it was a thrill for the semifinalists to meet him. It was later that a jury member canceled. And I remember it was later because at that point, it was the very beginning of the summer. I think it was like June when I found out. And the competition was, that year was in September. So I really didn't have much time. And to find somebody really appropriate to be on a Honens jury, and somebody who would be a recognizable name to the competitors or to many of the competitors. And I was able to get Alessio Bax to agree. He just was able to fit it into his schedule, and I was so grateful. So, you know, a lot of times that position is defined by some kind of surprise that comes up. And of course, one of the biggest surprises of all was, for everybody, was COVID. And that put us into, you know, a bit of a quandary. Like, it actually gifted us the realization that we could meet a lot more often by using Zoom, you know, which was a relatively rare commodity at that point. Not everybody was fluent in Zoom. And we actually started having meetings more often than we used to as a result of that. But I also realized early on, I think it was in late March of 2020, I realized, you know, we have high quality video and audio performances of all these pianists from the last at least 3 editions of the competition. And including all these incredible semifinalist performances of people who deserve to be seen and heard. And they're sitting in our archives, and technically speaking, in the old website, I think you could, you know, scrounge your way through the website and access them, but nobody would do that. I said, let's release, you know, 20 minutes worth every week, and I'll curate it and I'll host it, and I'll say a few introductory words. And I had bought all sorts of video and audio equipment. You can see cameras and things in the background. That's my overhead cam for when I do virtual teaching, so that you can see the keyboard. And it's just a beautiful quality, small, compact camera. So, so we did Honens at home for over a year. And it kept all of our Honens family and our supporters, everybody really close. And of course, we did virtual concerts and everything. So it was nothing like what we thought, because part of what we're supposed to be doing during this 3-year gap between competitions is finding opportunities for our most recent gold medal laureate and making sure that they're out there performing. That includes arranging for performances in major cities around the world, arranging for press coverage, paying for excellent publicity for them, enabling recordings to be made, anything possible to get big opportunities to come their way quickly. And 3 years is enough to get that process going, right? I mean, it takes quite a bit of time just to get concerts lined up and everything else. So we, of course, Nicolas Namoradze was our laureate, our prize laureate that year, and he basically lost a year of performing because of COVID. We ended up punting the competition 1 year into the future, so we ended up going 4 years between competitions, which gave us a chance to regroup and prepare, because a competition year is also a very expensive year for us. But it also meant that we didn't feel that Nico had lost a year's worth of our support. You know, he ended up basically having 4 years of support, of which 1 year not much was happening. So, so that worked out really well, and that's been important. Again, important for Illia Ovcharenko, who won Honens in 2022, and to keep making sure that he's getting good advice, guidance. We talk occasionally about just things that come up in the professional music world that, you know, he might not be sure how to handle. All of that is brilliant. But what's great is that both Nicolas Namoradze and both Illia Ovcharenko are, in totally different ways, personify what we call the complete artist. And they are both very important flag bearers for Honens going forward, and they know it, and they're very proud of it.
Yeah, and I even looking at Honens, even from my own side, I see them a lot on many of the most recent events and promotionals for the competition. I'm so glad you mentioned the complete artist, because that is essentially the backbone of Honens' philosophy. What is the complete artist? How do you embody the complete artist? And how do you educate others on what the complete artist is?
It's a very difficult question to answer with specifics, because art, of course, already is subjective in so many ways. But I think, okay, let's start with the idea that an obvious certain level of technical excellence and pianistic excellence is assumed. Not machine-like perfection, but really, really spectacular pianistic ability is a given. And then we start getting into your question earlier about musicality, and how much have they at their, what I can now look back on as a relatively young age, how much in their young age have they absorbed of not just the music world around them? Like, I would say that if you're going to play a Beethoven sonata, you are at a massive disadvantage if you have no familiarity with Beethoven string quartets written at about the same time. You also are at a disadvantage if you're not familiar with Beethoven symphonies. I mean, you can now, as a student, download for free the complete scores of all the Beethoven string quartets and symphonies in a matter of seconds, and use those as a study guide to get to know Beethoven and how Beethoven's constructed, and how his use of contrapuntal lines, and how the importance of bass lines, and how often is the melody actually in a treble, and how often is it actually somewhere else, and how are ideas layered and motives used and developed, and all these things which become, they're sometimes a little difficult to discover at the piano, because the piano is just one instrument. But as soon as you get into a quartet or a symphony, you have this body of instruments with completely different timbres, and you can start to understand Beethoven. And then we take it another level further. Well, if you're going to understand Ravel, I think it would be very helpful to understand French Impressionism as an art form. Manet, Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, and later Van Gogh, and what's happening there, Like, how can we understand the idea of Impressionism, and as a visual form and as a musical form? If you're playing Schumann, or if you're playing Liszt, it's incredibly helpful to have read literature dating from that period that maybe helps to describe some of the things they're talking about. I mean, you played the Dante Sonata, I mean, Dante wrote some major stuff, and the Inferno is a little bit a part of what's going on in quite a bit of Liszt's music, I think, at times, So all of those things help to inform your artistry. If you were to ask, you asked me what would make me a complete artist, I think part of it was probably that I'm sure that I'm an incomplete artist, and there's always something that I haven't learned yet. But I like to be very open to new experiences. And I don't pretend to know how they're going to affect me as an interpreter of piano music, but I know that they will somehow. And those experiences include when I was in my early 20s attending Banff School. Word got around pretty quickly that I was not only a good pianist, but a really fierce sight reader and a pretty fast learner. And also that I was too nice to say no to anybody. So, I mean, I literally said yes to, it's one thing, pianists generally end up at a certain point playing chamber music, or they certainly should. But I ended up playing weird things like Hindemith sonatas for, I don't remember if it was trombone or tuba and piano, or accompanying violinists in showpieces, salon pieces, where really the piano part's, it's absolutely an accompaniment. And every one of those experiences helped me grow as an artist, right? Like I didn't know that at the time. I was just too nice to say no. And so, but I got myself into all these musical experiences that were out of my comfort zone of being a solo pianist. And accompanying, as opposed to playing chamber music, which of course is an important skill, but actual accompanying where 90% of the musical decisions are coming from, let's use as a good example, a violinist playing some kind of showpiece. And the piano part is very much an accompaniment, very much sometimes repetitive figures over and over and over again. And you can either be bored out of your mind, or you can experience the solo line through playing your accompaniment, which turns out, I realized years later, is a fantastic lesson for playing most of classical music, where the accompaniment figure that you might be playing in the upper part of your left hand can experience what the melody is doing in the upper part of your right hand and complement it in so many ways that you just don't think about otherwise, And I always love collaborating with musicians that are a little outside of the box of classical musicians. I've had tiny collaborations with a few jazz pianists, but I'm so bad at jazz. I love to play jazz as a hobby, but I can't read chord charts and play them in a certain style the way they can. That's totally beyond me, but I love to learn jazz tunes anyway. And I had the opportunity 10 years ago to form a band with the very famous rock drummer from the band The Police from back in the 80s, Stuart Copeland. And Stuart sort of brought some of the fun back to playing for me. I mean, and he's also a really, really good chamber music player. We were jamming, a group of 5 of us. We jammed for about, 30 minutes. And just to kind of get to know each other a little bit. And we finished. And Stuart, the rock drummer, looks at all of us and says, okay, let's try this again. And this time, stop assuming that you're doing the most important thing, and always assume that somebody else is doing the most important thing. And if that's true, support that. And let's try it again. And we tried it again, and it was infinitely better. And I was thinking, well, that's pretty much exactly what I would tell a pianist in a chamber music coaching. I would tell everybody in a chamber music coaching, be ready to support something that is maybe more important than what you're playing at that moment. And also, Stuart has so much fun when he performs. And I've always had fun when I perform, but occasionally I'll let things get too serious. And then I just felt like I could let loose again. So all of those things, I think, can contribute to your complete sense that the world of music, the world of literature, of visual art, of architecture, of sculpture, that all of those things can combine, and of course of different kinds of music, right? I mean, I listen to lots of jazz. I've always listened to lots of rock and roll. My daughter introduced me to dubstep, and she said, you have to hear what a dubstep drop is, a bass drop. And she played this tune for me, Skrillex, I think it was. And there's this fantastic bass drop, and I thought, yeah, Schubert did that 200 years ago in the B-flat sonata, his last piano sonata, when there's a trill and then it drops down to a G-flat, and it's kind of the same idea. It's just like a real different way of expressing it, And I mean, how valuable that is. Or I was more familiar with Pink Floyd in the 70s than I was with Beethoven symphonies. So the first time I finally listened to Beethoven 9, and, which opens with that open A and E, and it opens with that open harmony for so long, and the harmony doesn't change for so long. And then finally, when it changes, it's earth-shattering. And I realized, that's exactly the same as the Pink Floyd album, Wish You Were Here. which starts with a G minor chord, synthesized and continuous, that goes on, and there's little like droplets of sound, and then finally there's a guitar voice right in the center of the sound. And the moment when that guitar voice lands on an E natural and Pink Floyd harmony changes to a C7 chord is just mind-boggling. And just like Beethoven 9, the same idea, just this one harmony for so long and the profound moment where it changes. So I think being able to relate from all these different worlds into your own specific little tunnel vision world and opening it up, a lot of that is part of being a complete artist. I mean, seeing Nicolas Namoradze, who during COVID went online to King's College and got himself a degree in neuroscience. I mean, brilliant guy. And now does, among all the spectacular performing that he does, is doing a series called Music and the Mind, Music Over Mind, he's doing a series called Mind Over Music. And in that is doing a lot of serious exploring sports psychology. How do you get to that state of mind that you perform at your absolute best? And he's also been wearing an EKG cap, which is measuring his brain waves while he's performing different kinds of music. And so how incredibly interesting to have a project like that, a project that we can learn from. And so that sort of embodies the complete artist too. I mean, it's an all-encompassing term in a way, but it really speaks to thoughtfulness as an interpreter and openness to a lot of ideas.
Wow, very, very well said. And that's such an amazing explanation of the complete artist. From what I'm getting, it's very, very holistic view of the context within the music and outside of the music, within the performance and outside of the performance, within the composer and outside of the composer. It's the explanations for it is potentially infinite.
Well, so here, let me tell you what we actually do at Honens to try to identify that, because, it's if somebody performs brilliant etudes and maybe a partita and a couple of sonatas and a concerto really well, it can all be at an incredibly high pianistic and musical and, of course, artistic standard, but it's a little hard to know some of this other X factor stuff. So Honens over the years has innovated, and many of those innovations happened when I was not involved at Honens. That includes moving to the model of not saying you need to play one of these 10 sonatas and one of these 15 etudes, but basically saying you've got 45 minutes, have at it. Play whatever you want. And then maybe if you make it to the semifinals, we're going to give you a short Canadian piece to learn. But otherwise, you program, so that the jury can actually see if you have a creative sense about you with programming. And we've seen some fascinating programs that have really helped us understand the mind behind the music, so to speak, with the competitors. Something that I added, and this will make perfect sense after what I was just talking about, something that I added to the Honens competition for the 2022 edition, and we're doing it again for 2025, is that while it's been standard for some time to have a collaborator come and perform with the semifinalists, in 2022 we had the great Canadian violinist Martin Beaver play one of the 10 Beethoven violin sonatas, and this year we have the great Canadian cellist Rachel Mercer, principal of NACO, and in both cases, they will be playing a major sonata. Rachel will be playing a major cello sonata with each of the 10 semifinalists. She will also be playing a salon piece, a short, like it's going to be 3 or 4 minutes long, and it's going to be a light piece that showcases the cello, in which the pianist is just playing an accompaniment. And there's no pianism really to show off very much, because typically those accompaniments are not hard. But there's plenty of musicianship to show off, tons of artistry to show off, and especially that kind of collaborative skill where you're willing to live inside somebody else's interpretation and support it 100%. The sonata should show that they collaborated and that they both, added to the ideas. But the accompaniment, not so much. The accompaniment should be just, I'm supporting this. And my experience in my career and my life is that I do that a lot. I love accompanying when I get a chance. I love playing chamber music. And it's part of everything else that I do. I mean, my career started mostly playing concertos and recitals, and I still do a lot of both of those things, but I like all these other ways of working together. The Honens quarterfinalists, semifinalists, and finalists are all interviewed by a professional arts journalist. And those interviews, in certain cases along the way, are actually made available to the jury, and the jury judges those interviews. That's a very special process that is gives them an idea of what's going on in these young artists' minds. What are they thinking about? If you were to ask, I mean, we don't try to surprise them. I mean, they're given it. They have an idea of what the questions are going to be. But if you ask a question like, you've just taken over a summer chamber music festival, how would you curate your first season? What would you do? I mean, you learn a lot about their thought process if you ask a question like that, which is, I think, one that we asked in 2022. And we also have, I suggested another really great thing, which would be completely realistic for the career of a pianist who plays recitals, is that they should, after their big solo recital, play an encore, and that they should, after one of their performances in the competition, play an encore, walk up to a microphone, and announce that encore from the stage, and just say why it's special to them, and then play it. It's just a brief moment that this isn't so much about complete artist in a way, but it's a little bit more that it gives the audience a chance to connect with them in a direct way, just hearing them speak for a minute, We also have a special process. I'm not aware of any other competition doing this, and I'm not revealing a secret. This is all clearly laid out in the jury guide. It's just a very long guide, so most people don't read it. But it clearly spelled out in the guide, we have a procedure where each of the collaborating artists and the conductor, in the case of the finalists, immediately after the last person performs, each of those collaborating artists goes to the jury and reports back to the jury on what these 10 competitors were actually like to work with. Were they curious? Did they ask a lot of questions? Were they interested in sharing opinions? Did they understand the difference between a collaborative performance and an accompaniment? Do they have a sensitive instinct for playing with orchestra? And so we learn a lot about the competitors just by getting that feedback from the collaborators. So a lot of these things are unique to Honens and are innovations that have happened, stepwise fashion over the years, but they help us to get that complete picture.
And I think these innovations are what makes Honens not just unique, but also what stands out from many other piano competitions, because in many ways it also disproves a lot of the misconceptions of classical music being elitist and out of touch or out of reach and that sort of thing. I think this is a really good set of steps towards disproving that and then showing that the music here is very accessible, very much for everyone, and has so much to offer in terms of experiences. And with live streams coming in this year as well for Honens, I can assume that for those who are watching or are going to plan to watch the Honens Piano Competition, it's going to be very different from a sports competition. Now, you're not watching two teams playing their hearts out to see who can score the most points on the board. Music competitions, as I've described in the past, are very qualitative, not necessarily quantitative. So from your perspective, how can new audiences watch Honens and get the most out of their viewing and enjoyment of Honens and really also other music competitions?
Well, you like sports analogies, and to me, the way that I can describe Honens or any musical competition that's at this level to someone who's never attended one and has sort of no idea what to expect, it is so similar to figure skating in the Olympics, in the sense that there are technical hurdles that are assumed. I think maybe there are preliminary figure eights that they have to do. I don't know. There's maybe you have to actually prove that you can do them in the Olympics, but you don't have to play scales at any point for the jury at Honens. But it's assumed that you are at a very high level. And then where the musicianship and the artistry comes in, some of that you feel, and some of that you know that the jury members, the judges they have their own rubric for how they're deciding on what really works for them. I can tell you, this is what I tell my students, that in early rounds of a competition, like when you're still listening to 50 people and you have to choose 10, which is how our quarterfinals work, very often your first instinct as a judge is to look for a reason to disqualify somebody, because you have to disqualify most of them. As things get narrowed down, and certainly when you get to the level of the semifinals, and most especially when you get to the level of the finals, and this always surprises the competitors, because they always think, well, maybe my octaves should have been faster, or maybe I didn't play that phrase with the right voicing, or, there's always some little funny detail that wouldn't matter to a lot of people that they think could be the deciding factor. And my experience with having been on many juries also, including at Cliburn and at Hilton Head and others, my experience being on a jury and most of my colleagues is they respond to the performance that moved them. And it's that simple. They felt moved. They felt transported. They felt that they were no longer judging a competition. They felt like they were experiencing something meaningful and important. And if you can get that to happen, then, and you can get enough people on your side. Another thing I should talk about is how brilliant our scoring system is, because it's better than any other competition's scoring system that I've ever seen. And it was formed in the very beginning of the competition by Moses Rennert and Ernest Enns, two mathematicians living and working in Calgary. And Moshe Rennert still supervises this aspect of the competition directly. And I won't go into all the details, and again, you can read all those details on the Honens website, but to basically sum it up, judges give a score, Moshe takes a look at the score, and let's say that we're going from 10 semifinalists down to 3 finalists. He might come back to you and say, okay, you definitely have a solid majority that you want one person in the finals, or maybe it's 2 people who are going to be in the finals. It's never all 3. There's always some debate. But let's say that it's 1. And he says, okay, that person's in the finals. We don't have to talk about them anymore. You've spoken with your secret ballot, and they are always secret ballots. But he said there's 4 people that some of you feel very strongly about, some of you feel okay about, and we need to still pick 2 more of them to be finalists. And before we talk about them, does anybody on the jury think that we left somebody out? And that's a big opportunity for a jury member to actually speak in front of the other jury members, because otherwise they're not allowed to talk about their opinions, and say, I'd like us to talk about competitor X, who I think, might be a little unconventional in some way, but just really was so original that I just feel we should discuss their viability as a possible person. And then there's a thoughtful discussion. And so that adds 1 more person to this, and then there's another vote, and then eventually it gets worked down that way. What happens is, as a jury member, you may or may not agree 100% with all the details of a final result. But you will have had a chance to advocate for somebody, and you will have had a chance to speak your mind in a very controlled environment. No discussion about the people you don't have to talk about. The ones who are clearly through, the ones who are clearly not through, just don't even mention. But whatever that debate is, it's nuanced, it's structured. Sometimes we have several more secret ballot votes to get it really narrowed down. But it's fantastic. And Moshe, has said, this is a system where even somebody as, temperamentally volatile and divisive in terms of opinions as Glenn Gould, who was obviously a genius, but also very controversial as specifically an interpreter of piano music, for at least some repertoire. He says even Glenn Gould could win a competition like this. He might not average out very well because there'd be some strong fors and some strong againsts, but theoretically, after discussion, there would be at least a possibility. So, and that's a good way of looking at it from the standpoint of, we do want a creative genius to shine, and we want them to have an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, it's very rare to hear this level of transparency. Of course, nowadays competitions are more transparent than ever before, but it's very rare to hear this level of transparency, even down the judging criteria. It's really good to hear that. And when you mentioned, having someone like Glenn Gould be able to win the competition, or Glenn Gould like future kind of pianists to win the competition, I think of also Ivo Pogorelic, even back in his run at the 1980 Chopin competition. I won't get into the details of that because it's already been well recorded in the past, but a similar situation, I would say, in his own experience with that. Also very genius in his interpretations, even to this day, but also very controversial in his own right back in that day as well, in terms of his performing approach and strategies. So, but it's truly fascinating to hear just the extent of the combination between this, along with musicality and the complete artist philosophy being put together. And I think this is what makes Canada have such an amazing potential to become a major classical music center for the world in not the far future, but even just within the present and the near future, especially with how well Canadian pianists are doing since, I want to even say, the last 5 years with Bruce Lee winning the International Chopin Competition in 2021. Then 2023, we've got Eric Guo winning the International Chopin Competition on period instruments. And then in 2024, the second Canadian to win the Leeds International Competition. We have that one there as well. So it's really, and even this year now, with the International Chopin Competition, we've got 5 Canadians also representing the country in Warsaw. Even with cliburn, we have a number of cliburn finalists who are also competing in the Honens International Competition. So this is going to be a very stacked year, not just for Canada in terms of competitions, but just like for musical culture and cultivation in this nation.
Yeah, it's true. And it is sort of funny, some competitions are on a 3-year cycle, some are on a 4-year cycle. Some competitions, depending on where they were in that cycle or where COVID was in that cycle, had to add an extra year. Honens did, Leeds didn't, if I remember. So every once in a while, it's like an eclipse or something, every once in a while, everything all lines up, And so, there have been a lot of competitions happening this year. And the level of playing and artistry for the 10 semifinalists is just fantastic. We're delighted that after having had no Canadians in the semifinalists and Honens for at least 3 editions of the competition, we have 2. We're delighted to have 3 women out of 10 in the semifinalists, which actually exactly represents the ratio of male applications and female applications is almost exactly 70%, 30%. And that's not true in a lot of competitions where you see predominantly male finalists or semifinalists and finalists. So I'm really very happy about that. And but it's just fun to have some Canadians in there. In Calgary when the competition is taking place, there's people start deciding on who they're rooting for, and of course the home hosts are rooting like mad for their competitor. And but there will be certainly some people who are watching in Canada who are rooting for the Canadians, which they haven't been able to do for years. And I think that's great. Why not? And it'll be an interesting experience to watch online because we will have online hosts, and they'll be discussing a lot of what's going on. So that for example, if you're watching figure skating and you really don't know the difference between an axel and a salchow, somebody will tell you. And here, if you don't know the difference between an octave and an arpeggio, somebody might happen to mention that and get you straight on that. And then, of course, if you're in Calgary, there's no substitute for hearing these pianists live. I mean, it's just so exciting. So, October is just going to be crazy exciting, and we're just so looking forward to it.
And so am I, and we look forward to seeing these 10 semifinalists play their hearts out and perform their hearts out at the 2025 Honens International Piano Competition. As we begin to close this episode, what is your advice to those who want to pursue a career in classical music, especially piano?
Well, for piano, I would say, get to know the musical world around you, which is what I was mentioning earlier. Don't be a hermit, and don't be exclusive to only what you know that you're being told to learn. That's really important because you have no idea. You might turn out to have a career. You might have great musical instincts and understanding that you develop, and maybe pianistically you're never going to be entering Honens. You might become a recording engineer. You might become an artist manager. You might become a composer and arranger. Who knows? There's so many different avenues in music, and of course you might do a lot of teaching. So there's so much to learn around you. It's a very difficult thing because for piano majors who are undergrads are very often still just trying to figure out, they were really good pianists up through high school, and so they just kind of automatically went to college in piano. And then they start realizing that the chance of becoming successful and making a good living out of it, it's a bit daunting. I mean, there are a lot of very good young pianists around, which thankfully, it's keeping the music world going, but there's kind of too many, I think, and I think a lot of undergrad pianists start noticing that. So by the time they're grad pianists, I feel like they've for sure committed to piano and to music, as a career. And then it's really important to just have your eyes open and just look around and make opportunities for yourself. I mean, pianists have to be entrepreneurial a little more than some other musicians. And I have several former students who have started a music series in Houston, for example, where I teach, and have that sort of business savvy a little bit, an entrepreneurial savvy to do that and create something, which of course can be an avenue for them to perform, but also is, for many other people too, and to raise awareness and everything else. So that's very important. I mean, being a part of the community around you is important. That's always been so important for Honens to do that. I mean, we have a program now called Keys for Newcomers, which has worked directly with Ukrainian refugees in Calgary and connects piano teachers with piano students, and gives them the resources to be able to make that happen. I mean, that's a profound way of being helpful in the community of the city of Calgary, where Honens is based, and to have projects like that. For many times when I'm in town, I mentioned before, I go into schools and do kids concerts, and I've been sort of training our gold medal laureates to do the same. Like, let's do a kids concert together, so you kind of see, like, you're probably not going to play the complete Brahms' third piano sonata for kids, so let's work out what works, and it's very exciting to be a part of all of that.
Certainly is. So many piano competitions, so little time. Canada's Honens competition, however, may be onto something, as said by the New Yorker. And in my eyes, you definitely are onto something amazing here with the Honens competition. And Jackie, thank you so much for coming on to the show, sharing your career, also sharing in detail the whole process of Honens. And I also look forward to not just tuning into Honens, but also hoping to promote Honens to the best of my own capacity as well, and through this podcast and also through outside of this podcast as well. I'm certainly going to be very excited as a pianist myself, someone who used to perform back during my high school days up until before university. Very much looking forward to seeing how Honens will grow Canada into a cultural center for classical music and really inspire the communities around them. Jackie, thank you so very much.
Oh, Amos, a huge pleasure. Thank you so much. Really great to talk to you.
And thank you very much to our audience for tuning in to this episode of This is the Legend of, as we've honed in on Honens. You've just heard the living legend of Jon Kimura Parker, also affectionately known as Jackie to friends new and old. You can follow him on his website, www.jonkimuraparker.com. You can also follow the Honens International Piano Competition on their website, www.honens.com. You can also subscribe to the Honens YouTube channel at Honens Official, as well as all their social media platforms, simply at Honens. Also, for our podcast, you can also subscribe to the YouTube channel here. For Zondo, the like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel and click on the bell notification icon so you'll always be up to date whenever we upload here. If you follow us on our audio platforms, be sure to click the follow button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts episodes onto your device. Once again, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Signing off for now, this is Amos Vang. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.